First, an appreciation, Dr. Jennings. You provided something more akin to poetry than, say, systematic, rationalized prose. I expect you got that idea from God, since you're talking about creation and the texts that the spirits help provide in Genesis and Psalms and John, as you note, and in Colossians, as you note, are all poems. And I think this is because there's things poetry can do that prose can't. Poetry is more guttural, more physical, more sensing, all matters that you engage. And poetry then allows, well, creativity in a different way. And in that's your invitation into this creativity, into this poetry. You're luring us into something. And it seems to me like what you're saying is, come on over here and look around. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look around your poem, your writings, this habitus, and I'm going to describe what I see. Now, obviously, I bring myself when I come inside that habitus, and that has both the limits and the benefits of me being there. Several years ago, Alexandra Horowitz wrote about her neighborhood, but she wrote about it in a particular way in a book called On Looking. Each chapter is a walk in her neighborhood or a nearby neighborhood in New York, and each time she is with somebody else, somebody who has different eyes. The first chapter is her toddler son, who obviously sees the streets, the neighborhoods, the stuff there differently than she does. One time she's walking with a geologist. As they walk by a building, he points out the limestone. The limestone that he says is from Indiana, made from sea creatures at the bottom of an ocean in Indiana. Obviously, that was not a house that Horowitz was living in. And so he's providing a place to live, to see, to sense that's different than what she had had before. Other walks are with an urban sociologist who is working on common spaces, a naturalist who is specializing in insects. In other words, each person, because they practice their life, their career, they're sensing differently, they're creating a different habitus together as they walk in the streets of Manhattan. It's that walking, it's that seeing through the eyes of others, it's that alterity that I believe that Dr. Jennings is inviting us into. Horowitz talks about how we're selective in our seeing. And so she invites us into something called selective enhancement. We can choose who's going to enhance our seeing. And Dr. Jennings says, okay, let's start with Jews. Let's start with Jewish Jesus and see what kind of seeing, sensing is possible then. This is what Dr. Jennings does. And he poses this perspective, this theological, cultural, historical perspective. The Jews had been traveling with Creator God in their praying, playing, feasting, in their deviations and returning. In all of these ways, they had been living with their Creator, and in this, they were countering the claims of others who were claimants to being their gods. And so because they have practiced this, they live in creation in a particular way. And so Dr. Jennings says that if we as Christians claim Israel's Creator as our God, we're incapable of living, dwelling rightly in creation without koinonia, this shared habitus with our Jewish family. Our own Western habitus is shaped by modernity's promotion of individualism, control, power, per Dr. Jennings, colonial modernity. Those traits mix with mercantilism toward consumer capitalism, modern management theories. These are no longer just matters of business and buying as if they ever were, but matters of how we perceive, how we perform, how our identities are formed, how we make home. My I, our we, are formed in practices, and those practices form perceiving, our selective attention. My practices of commodifying and consuming, our practices of building and defending, our practices of targeting and possessing, these shape our perceiving. This is how we perceive creation. This is how we form home, habitus. So in the midst of poetry, Dr. Jennings invites us home. This is a metaphor, but more than a metaphor. This is not to a home defined by mortgages, but a different oikonomia, a different belonging and place and stewarding and sharing and cohabitus. Jennings figures the density of listening that comes through alterity. So rather than mastery, we could have cohabitation, dwelling in communion and reciprocity. But that can't work if we only seek to be masters. So without alterity, we cannot perceive home. We cannot dwell as the Creator's clan in creation. If we aim to perceive Creator and creation, we need alterity, the eyes of others. We need the eyes that have been shaped inside other stories, inside other activities and practices. And then in our vocation as church, as followers of Jesus, it's there we frequently speak of discernment. But discernment requires alterity also. Discernment is blind if it's done in the midst of homogeneity. That's why churches are blind if planning and leadership and theology are all shaped without alterity. That's why whatever is called discernment in church gatherings, in our plans and promotions and programs, fail to escape the cul-de-sacs of Western Christianity, which too often now is just religious nationalism accompanied by entertainment. Only by new practices can we disentangle the cluster of practices that got us here. Only by foregoing our consumer preferences, our circling the wagons, our managed plans, can we enter a different habitus, a new creation. There's no managed plan, rather the oikos of God, the Ephesians vocation of dwelling in God's mystery, graces us with a welcome. God is welcoming us to a new habitus, a dwelling that refigures our own dwelling. Come over here and look around. Jews and Gentiles, and expanded elsewhere in Paul's letters, women and men, servants and free, give up your blindness. See the creation and the new creation that God is creating. This alterity is a gift, not only far but near, among your neighbors, your kin, in your own home. God did not cease being an agent. So if we gain sight through alterity, through action reflection, the Creator and new creation can be perceived. As Dr. Jennings said, we are following the Spirit of the living God into the intimate places of the living world. Only through alterity and tentative improvising can we step in this direction. As a theologian, as a professor, as a consultant, I have the privilege of promoting and seeing this. It hasn't been unusual in teaching DMin classes with a friend, Alan Roxborough, that during commencements when families were present or some of our other annual gatherings, a spouse in these situations, a wife, would often come up to us and say, or ask, "What have you done with my husband?" And suppressing a grin, I'd ask, "He's right there, what do you mean?" And it was always something like this: "He listens to me. He didn't listen to me before. Well, he listened, but he didn't really listen. Something has happened. Tell me what's happened." And in every situation, this had to do with a practice that we would give these pastor students. And that was a practice of dwelling in their neighborhoods, dwelling among their own neighbors in nearby shopping districts, other common spaces, parks, shopping centers, wherever it was that they could be rubbing shoulders with neighbors with alterity, but not just walking and seeing, but asking, getting stories, listening, and to be there not as professional clergy, but as a neighbor. And this, without exception, would start reshaping the perceiving that Dr. Jennings notes. Not long ago, we were also in Korea, where we've been doing consulting work, and I was in a room with some 20 pastors who had been practicing this same set of activities. And it was supposed to be a brief check-in that I was leading, and I'd ask, "How's it been going? What have you been seeing?" And the second pastor who shared said, "I need to tell you that I had to do something before I could come today. I asked my son if we could talk." He's a teenager. And I told him that I hadn't been the father I should have been, and I'd realized I'd never listened to him. that I don't know his friends or his school. I don't know what he likes doing. And I said, I don't want to be a father like that anymore. I'm sorry for that. And I want to try something new. Will you forgive me? Well, what was supposed to be a 30-minute check-in ended up taking all morning. As story after story came from these whose habitus was changed by Alterity, by store owners and neighbors, by people on benches, by their own sons. They were being changed, their habitus changed. Not long ago, I was with a group of Jewish businessmen in Burbank. Most of them own businesses in downtown LA. And they asked me to do what I do as a theologian. And one of the things I do is spend time in Lectio. And so I passed out the passage from Jeremiah 29 about Jewish people in enemy territory in Babylon in exile. And so in a meditative practice that was developed by our Jewish friends, we read and reread and reread Jeremiah's letter to these exiles about planting gardens and building homes and having kids and seeking the welfare of the city where they were. Not the normal approach to wanting a violent God to overthrow the enemy so they can get back to the Jerusalem project. And as we read this over and over, these men and women started saying, well, they had businesses on streets with neighbors they didn't know, in this case, almost always homeless people. And while they were kind people with food and other provisions, they started asking how they might listen, maybe even labor together, maybe learn together. It was an amazing couple of hours. So we receive or we reject a habitus, a home and story to dwell in. Either the story of gods who destroy, who claim and control, who invite us to commodify and consume, or the habitus, the oikos of God in Jesus Christ, the oikos of Alterity. So we're invited to perceive through the other what God is doing, this creator God who still creates. Rather than consuming and controlling, we enter and love and touch and handle and plant and eat and share. A koinonia, a habitus, a perceiving, a dwelling. We are engaged by God in creation and new creation. So back to Dr. Jennings' poetry. Let us try this again, but now with noise, a cacophony of voices that none of us can control.